My name is Emily Walker, and for most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, and stayed patient long enough, my family would eventually accept me. I was wrong. Some people don't reject you because you've done something wrong. They reject you because they've already decided you don't belong. That lesson became painfully clear on the night of my father's 25th wedding anniversary. It started only a few hours earlier. I stood in front of the mirror inside my apartment in Dallas, Texas, trying to cover the dark bruise under my left eye. Every layer of makeup made it slightly lighter, but nothing could hide it completely. The injury wasn't caused by an accident. It was caused by my stepsister, Madison Walker. Earlier that afternoon, we had argued after I reminded her to visit Grandpa William. He had recently returned home from the hospital, and the doctor had instructed us not to leave him alone for long. Madison rolled her eyes. "I'm not wasting my Saturday babysitting an old man." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "He's your grandfather too," I replied. She laughed. "No, he's your problem." Before I could answer, she grabbed a crystal vase from the hallway table and threw it across the room. I barely had time to react. The vase smashed into my face. Pain exploded through my head and I collapsed onto the hardwood floor. Blood trickled down my cheek. Karen, my stepmother, ran into the room after hearing the crash. For one brief second, I thought she was coming to help me. Instead, she wrapped her arms around Madison. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Madison nodded dramatically. "Emily wouldn't stop arguing with me." Karen looked at me with complete frustration. "Why do you always create problems in this house?" I couldn't believe it. I was the one bleeding, yet somehow I was still the villain. Sadly, that had been my life for nearly 20 years. My mother died when I was 7 years old. 2 years later, Dad married Karen. At first, she treated me kindly, but after Madison was born, everything changed. Little by little, I became invisible. Madison always received expensive birthday gifts. I received practical necessities. Madison was praised for average grades. I was expected to be perfect. When Dad's construction company struggled financially, I quietly helped pay the bills using money I earned from working while attending college. No one thanked me. No one even acknowledged it. Despite everything, I still loved my family. Maybe that was my biggest mistake. That evening, Dad and Karen were celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary at one of the finest hotels in Dallas. Nearly 300 guests had been invited. Business owners, family friends, neighbors, city officials. It was one of the biggest social events of the year. I wanted to stay home, but Grandpa William had called me that morning. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Emily, promise me you'll come tonight." "I don't think it's a good idea, Grandpa." "Please," he said softly, "there are things you deserve to know." I had never heard him sound like that before. So, despite my injury, I went. The ballroom looked breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Fresh white flowers covered every table. A live jazz band played while guests laughed and celebrated. The moment I walked inside, the room became quiet. People noticed the bruise immediately. Whispers spread through the crowd. "What happened to Emily? Did she have an accident? That looks painful." Before I could answer, my father raised his glass. He smiled. "Well, it looks like someone finally taught Emily how to stay out of trouble." A few guests laughed. Others looked uncomfortable. I stood frozen. The embarrassment hurt even more than the bruise. I looked toward Karen, hoping she would stop him. Instead, she smiled politely. Emily has always been a little dramatic. My heart sank. Madison stood beside them, wearing an elegant black dress. She looked directly at me. Then she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who believed she had already won. I quietly walked toward an empty table near the back of the ballroom. For nearly an hour, I sat alone. I watched people congratulate my father.
They called him a wonderful husband, a respected businessman, a devoted family man. If only they knew the truth. Across the room, Grandpa William never stopped watching me. His expression wasn't angry. It was filled with disappointment. Not in me, but in the family he had spent his entire life trying to build. A few minutes later, Madison walked over and leaned close enough that no one else could hear her. "Enjoy tonight," she whispered, "because tomorrow you'll have nothing left." I frowned. "What does that mean?" She smiled confidently. "You'll find out soon." Before I could ask another question, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we cut the anniversary cake, Mr. William Walker would like to share a few words." The audience applauded. Grandpa slowly stood. Although he was 78 years old, he walked toward the stage with remarkable confidence. He placed a large sealed envelope on the podium. Then he looked around the ballroom. First at my father, then at Karen, then at Madison. Finally, his eyes met mine. His voice was calm, but every word echoed through the silent ballroom. "For 20 years, I've carried a secret that has torn this family apart." He paused, then he held up the envelope. "Tonight, the truth finally comes out." The applause stopped. The smiles disappeared. And for the first time in my life, I realized everything I believed about my family was about to change forever.
The ballroom fell completely silent. No one moved. No one even reached for their drinks. Grandpa William Walker stood at the podium, holding the large envelope in his hands. His eyes swept across the room before stopping on my father. "Richard," he said calmly, "for 20 years you've let this family believe a lie." My father's smile disappeared. "Dad," he said nervously, "this isn't the time." Grandpa shook his head. "No, this is exactly the time." He slowly opened the envelope and removed several documents. "I've stayed silent because I hoped this family would find its way back to kindness." He looked toward me. "But after what I witnessed today, I realized my silence has only protected the wrong people." The guests exchanged confused looks. Karen stood up. "William, you're embarrassing us." Grandpa didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, he raised the first document. 5 years ago, Richard Walker Construction was weeks away from bankruptcy. The room filled with whispers. Many of Dad's business partners looked shocked. No one had known the company had been struggling. Grandpa continued. The bank was ready to seize company equipment and foreclose on several properties. He turned toward me. Only one person stepped in to save the business. Everyone followed his gaze. Me. Grandpa held up copies of bank records. Emily emptied her savings account. She sold her late mother's jewelry. She even postponed graduate school. She invested nearly $180,000 to save this family's business. The ballroom erupted with disbelief. One businessman stared at my father. "Richard, why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Dad lowered his head. He couldn't answer, because the answer was simple. He wanted everyone to believe he had rescued the company himself. Grandpa placed those papers aside. Then he picked up another folder. This one is even more painful. Inside were hospital records and photographs taken only hours earlier. "This afternoon, Emily didn't suffer an accident." His voice grew stronger. "She was assaulted." Every guest looked at the bruise beneath my eye. Grandpa turned toward Madison. "Would you like to tell everyone what happened?" Madison folded her arms. "I didn't do anything." Grandpa nodded slowly. I expected that answer. He removed a small flash drive from his pocket. "I installed security cameras throughout my home last year after valuable items started disappearing." Madison's face turned white. Karen grabbed my father's arm. "Oh no." The hotel's event coordinator inserted the flash drive into the projector. Seconds later, security footage filled the giant screen. The entire ballroom watched in silence. The video showed Madison screaming at me inside Grandpa's house. Then, she grabbed the crystal vase. Without hesitation, she threw it directly at my face. The vase struck my eye. I collapsed onto the floor. Blood covered my cheek. But what happened next shocked everyone even more. Karen rushed into the room. Instead of helping me, she hugged Madison.
Then the camera clearly captured her saying, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Emily always gets blamed anyway." The video ended. No one spoke. Several guests looked away in disgust. One woman quietly whispered, "That's heartbreaking." A longtime family friend stood up. "I've known Richard for 30 years. I never imagined something like this was happening." My father buried his face in his hands. Karen stared at the floor. Madison began crying. "I'm sorry." No one responded. Grandpa slowly walked off the stage and stood beside me. He gently placed one hand on my shoulder. Then he faced the crowd again. "I have one final responsibility." He picked up another envelope. "My attorney prepared this yesterday." My father's eyes widened. "Dad," Grandpa interrupted him. "For decades, I planned to divide everything equally. My company, my investments, my ranch, my properties." He paused. "That plan has changed." Karen gasped. Madison shook her head in disbelief. Grandpa unfolded the final document. "As of today, every asset I own will be placed into the Walker Family Trust." The room became silent again. Then he looked directly at me. "The trustee and the future president of the Walker Family Foundation," he smiled proudly, "will be Emily Walker." Applause broke out across the ballroom. Many guests stood to their feet. My father looked completely defeated. Madison shouted, "This isn't fair!" Grandpa looked at her with sadness rather than anger. "Fair? For years, Emily carried this family on her shoulders, while the rest of you ignored her sacrifices. Fair would have been loving her the way she deserved." He turned back toward me. His expression softened. "Emily, I've told everyone part of the truth. But there is one secret." He paused, taking a slow breath, "that only you deserve to hear." I felt my heart pounding. "What secret?" Grandpa held up one last sealed envelope, the oldest one of all. "I promised your father I would never reveal it while he was alive." A chill ran through my body. He looked into my eyes. "Tomorrow morning, I'm finally going to tell you who your real parents were." The entire ballroom froze. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. Everything I thought I knew about my life suddenly felt uncertain. And I realized the biggest secret wasn't about money. It wasn't about the business. It was about me.
Didn't sleep that night. Grandpa's words were played in my mind over and over. "Tomorrow morning, I'm finally going to tell you who your real parents were." Nothing else mattered. Not the humiliation, not the bruises, not even the inheritance. I needed the truth. The next morning, Grandpa William called and asked me to meet him at the Walker family ranch, about an hour outside Dallas. The ranch had been in our family for generations. It was the one place where I had always felt safe. When I arrived, Grandpa was sitting on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee. He smiled warmly. "I knew you'd come." I sat beside him. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The Texas sunrise painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Finally, Grandpa handed me a small wooden box. "This belonged to your father." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were old photographs, a baby bracelet, a wedding ring, and dozens of handwritten letters. I looked at Grandpa. "My father?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." He took a deep breath. "Richard isn't your biological father." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What?" Grandpa looked into my eyes. "Your real father was my oldest son, Michael Walker." Tears instantly filled my eyes. "He and your mother, Sarah Walker, were killed by a drunk driver when you were only 2 years old." I covered my mouth. For 28 years, I had believed Richard was my father. Grandpa continued quietly. "Before Michael died, he made me promise that if anything happened to him, you would always grow up surrounded by family. He trusted Richard to raise you as his own daughter. He believed his little brother would protect you." Grandpa lowered his head. But somewhere along the way, Richard forgot his promise. Tears rolled down my face.
Suddenly, every painful childhood memory made sense. Every birthday I spent feeling invisible. Every family photo where I stood in the back. Every holiday where Madison opened expensive gifts while I smiled with whatever was left. It hadn't been my imagination. I had truly been treated differently. Grandpa gently squeezed my hand. I'm sorry I waited so long. I kept hoping your family would change. But after what happened yesterday, I realized protecting the secret was only protecting the people who hurt you. Just then, a truck pulled into the driveway. Richard stepped out first. Karen followed. Madison climbed out last. None of them looked like they had slept. Richard slowly walked toward me. His eyes were swollen from crying. He stopped a few feet away. Emily, I've spent my entire life trying to justify my mistakes, but I can't anymore. He wiped away his tears. My brother trusted me with the most precious thing he ever had. You. And I failed him. Karen stepped forward. I failed you too. I spent so many years protecting my own daughter that I stopped seeing yours. Madison couldn't stop crying. She looked completely different from the confident woman I had known. I hated how kind you were. I hated that Grandpa admired you. I hated that everyone respected you. So I convinced myself that destroying your confidence would somehow make me feel stronger.
She broke down. I'm ashamed of the person I became. I listened quietly. For years, I had dreamed about hearing those words. But standing there, I realized something unexpected. Revenge no longer interested me. I looked at Richard. I can't erase the past. I can't pretend those years never happened. But I also refuse to spend the rest of my life carrying anger. He nodded silently. I understand. Then I looked at Madison. If you truly want forgiveness, earn it. Not with words, with the choices you make every day. She quietly nodded. I will. Grandpa smiled proudly. A few weeks later, his attorney officially completed the paperwork. I became president of the Walker Family Foundation and CEO of the family's investment company. But instead of using the money to punish people, I used it to help others. We created scholarships for students who had lost parents. We funded shelters for women escaping abusive homes. We opened free counseling programs for families struggling with conflict. Within 2 years, the Walker Foundation had helped thousands of families across Texas. The business grew larger than anyone expected. Yet Grandpa reminded me every chance he got. Success isn't measured by how much you own. It's measured by how many lives you change. Those words became the mission of my life. Richard retired from the company and spent his time volunteering with veterans organizations. Karen dedicated herself to local charities. Madison completed counseling, earned a degree in social work, and began helping teenagers dealing with anger and family trauma. Trust didn't return overnight. Some wounds never disappear completely. But little by little, our family learned something we should have understood years earlier. Love isn't proven by words. It's proven by actions. One peaceful evening, Grandpa and I sat on the ranch porch watching the sunset over the Texas hills. He smiled. You know, Emily, your father would be proud of the woman you've become. I couldn't hold back my tears. I wish he could have seen this. Grandpa placed his arm around my shoulder. He does. A few months later, Grandpa William passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 80. More than 1,000 people attended his memorial service. Business leaders, neighbors, employees, students whose lives he had changed. They all came to honor the man who believed truth was always worth defending. As I stood at the podium that day, I looked at the crowd and smiled. My grandfather taught me that family isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by honesty, compassion, and the courage to do what's right. People may take your confidence. They may take your opportunities. They may even try to take your place. But they can never take your character. Today, whenever I look at the small scar beneath my left eye, I don't remember the pain. I remember the moment my life changed forever. Because that scar reminds me of something far more valuable than revenge. It reminds me that the truth always finds its way into the light. And in the end, the greatest victory isn't watching the people who hurt you fall. It's rising so high that their cruelty can never define who you become.